Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video where I am rebooting an old classic that a lot of you guys have enjoyed, the Study Chronicles. This is going to be a series in which I find a lot of my own leaks, as well as help you guys find your leaks with the most common scenarios in which 6 max cash game players deal with. So this is going to be a series for cash game players. MTT players can also benefit from this as well if you take the method of the study. However, it is going to be a strong focus on cash games, which is what I'm currently playing and trying to climb, as my previous videos have shown that I am trying to currently get to high stakes in cash games. This is going to help aid my process to get to the top, as well as also help me get better at poker. I think that Tombos over at GTO Wizard has nailed a method of studying, which I have previously used and I'm going to reuse in this reboot of the Study Chronicles. So first off, what is the Study Chronicles? It is a series of me going over what Tombos created as spot important spreadsheet. I'm going to pull that up right now. A while ago, he put out a spreadsheet to learn every single scenario, and he organized this spreadsheet in order of importance. So as you can see here, there's a bunch of configurations over on the left, and there are the pre-flop actions to which the scenarios are played, and the frequency to which they happen, and the starting pot size, the average pot size, and the EV of the scenario. So previously, we went over every single one of these scenarios, drilled them, and tried to see where we were making mistakes. And the whole idea of this process is to find where you're leaking EV and fix it. So this is a very streamlined process, and it helped me a lot along my journey. And because it helped me so much, I decided I was going to reboot this, because previously we didn't get to the end. In fact, we only got, I think, 6 scenarios deep. And I made about 13 videos previously looking at each side of the configuration. So I made a video looking at the small blind in a small blind versus big blind configuration. And then I made another separate video for the big blind. But for this reboot, I'm just going to do one video for one configuration. So we're going to look at both sides of the coin, and we're going to go into detail on each one. So this is going to be intense. There's going to be a lot of strategy jargon that, if you're not familiar with, I highly recommend checking out GTO Wizard's YouTube channel. They have a lot of great explanations over there. I've made some videos for them myself, but this is going to be targeted more at your intermediate to advanced player. You will be able to benefit from these videos if you are a beginning player, just to show you what it's like to really improve your game and how I approach it. But there are going to be some things in which you probably need to understand. Things like equity buckets, blockers, range advantages, all these kind of keywords that may have been covered in some other videos in the past. But I hope that this series will improve your game and give you the blueprint to move forward at whatever games that you're playing. So without further ado, I think I'm just going to jump in. Now, I'm showing you the original spot important spreadsheet that Tombos created. There has been an update. There's been several updates. I believe that this is the most recent version here. So you can see it looks a lot nicer. He used some good color coding. He also linked some important stats, kind of more visual graphs. And he also included some drills along with the aggregate ports to, make it easier to just click the drill and go. So we're going to start off with the most high priority formation, which once again, Everyone's favorite, the button versus the big blind single raise pot. So this is the most, it's not the most frequent scenario, but it is the highest priority scenario. So I have not entered any of my scores yet. The idea with this spreadsheet is that we study the formation, then we do the drill. So we drill all of the different hands that come up in the formation, and then we record our score that we got on Wizard. So this is going to be the method. And over time, we should fill out this entire spreadsheet. We're going to see where our leaks are, so where the scores are the lowest. And then maybe at the end of everything, we can go back, understand that the mistakes that we made and why we made them perhaps, and re-drill those and finish off this series with, a recap of everything, what I've learned, kind of what I think is important to do if you're trying to learn, as well as what is optimal at the end of everything. So this is going to be a learning process, not only for myself, but I hope for you guys as well, that you'll be able to pick up a lot as I go through this. Let's dive in. So the first formation, button versus big blind, single raise pot. I'm going to pull up Wizard right here. Now, the only difference in Tombos' spreadsheet and what I'm going to do is that Tombos uses a certain solution, the simple solution in a 6-max 500 NL rake structure game. So if you're trying to follow along, or you're trying to do Tombos's spot importance drills as well, then you're going to have to manually change the solution. So for the drill here, you can just click and it'll pull up the drill, and then you can change out the settings depending on whatever solution you want to use for the drill. So pretty simple. Not too complicated, but that's the method to using whatever solution that you want to use. I am going to use the solution that I've been using for a while now, because I feel like it's the best strategy for myself, and I like a more complicated strategy. So I have typically used the general GTO NL 500 GTO, the double GTO you can see here, solution. And this includes some strategies that may be a little more complicated, like flatting the small blind, flatting the button versus a raise. The sizings are a bit different than the simple one. Post flop is a little different. You have more than just one or two sizings post flop. So it does get more intense, but it's very rewarding, and I think it's worth using for myself at the higher stakes, because the thin edges come from the players that are going to be more prepared, using more complicated strategies. They're going to be harder to execute. That's a big argument against them. However, if you can execute them to a good level, then you're going to find a lot of edge on other players that haven't studied the same things you have. So a lot of benefits for myself for using the general GTO ranges. But if you're newer, I probably suggest using something like the simple, like Tombos does in his spreadsheet. Also very important, make sure you're selecting the right rake for whatever games that you're playing. There's going to be a big difference between NL 500 and NL 50 GG. So make sure that you're selecting the right one that is closest to your game. Okay, enough yapping. This is the first scenario, button versus big blind. The thing I like to first do with all of these scenarios is look at the opening range. This is probably going to be the most similar across all of the solutions. It's going to be an open for about 2.5x. Now, there are some other strategies that have you opening larger or smaller on the button, depending on what you want to do. But I am going to mainly stick to whatever I think is game theory optimal. according to what the solution is that we've picked, and that's going to be open 2.5x on the button. I do think that this is probably the most common sizing to open, so it is very relevant here. Some players open 3x, some players open 2x, like I mentioned. So once we get to the open, we're now going to see the big blind response. The big blind response is going to be a call or a 3-bet. Now, again, the 3-bet's going to change a lot depending on what sizing you choose for your solution, but it is going to affect the construction of your range. The larger you go, the more polarized your range is going to be. So you're going to see some weaker hands in there if you're going 13 big blinds, or if you're going something like 10 big blinds, you might see a more linear range. So it really does depend on the sizing choice you have here. And just keep in mind that other players are going to constantly use different sizings. So it's important that you're studying not just one sizing, but a few different sizings for the 3-bet. So that's the idea. And we are going to use the 13. But keep in mind, it's going to change for everybody. So the first thing I want to do is look at what we're opening. Well, the bottom of our range seems to be something like ace-3 offsuit, something like 5-3 suited, something like 8-5 suited. I typically look at the bottom of range because a lot of these hands are fairly intuitive to open at the top. Obviously, you're opening aces all the way down to pocket deuces on the button. These are pairs that are going to perform well when there's only 2 players left. Stuff like that should be fairly intuitive to you at this point. But the bottom of range is going to adjust again depending on the strategy. For us, it's going to be Jack-3 suited, 10-5 suited, 8-5 suited, 5-3 suited. So what does this range lack? Most of the weak offsuit combos like Queen-8 offsuit, Queen-Deuce offsuit, 5-Deuce offsuit. All of these offsuit combos here that are weaker, we're just going to be folding those. So as a heuristic, I like to tell myself, okay, so if I'm opening the button, maybe I'm opening the offsuit combos that can make straights that have some kind of 10 Jack or 9 in it at the bottom. So Jack-8 offsuit, 10-8 offsuit, 9-8 offsuit, and then you have some King-7 offsuit that's going to be indifferent. Is it important to open in different hands? That is a question you're going to have to answer for yourself. Do you feel like the blinds are playing optimally? If they aren't, then you can probably start deviating a lot from these solutions. If they are, then you want to be sticking to these solutions. A lot of people are using pre-flop charts these days to study with, and they're going to be approximately close to what GTO looks like pre-flop. But again, you have to make that assessment for yourself. Do you think that players are overfolding, underfolding, etc.? So going to the response to the open, you can see that with the 13 big blind 3-bet, we have some polarized hands here. The first thing that kind of jumps out at me is that we have a lot of 3-bets at a mixed frequency. So we have a lot of 3-bets from some suited jacks, some suited queens, some suited kings. We have the pure 3-bets from 10s plus. You can see here, there aren't that many pure 3-bets outside of the premium hands. You're not going to see very many bluffs at a pure frequency other than maybe something like 10-9 suited, ace-5 suited. And I don't even think I would call ace-jack suited a weak hand. So yeah, there's not too many weak hands that are going to be pure 3-betting. So the way the solver tends to operate is it has its obvious value hands, and then it matches the weaker hands with those stronger hands that make the most sense with blocker effects, with equity distribution, all that kind of stuff, so that you have a complete strategy and you're not just 3-betting pure with your strong hands and a few different combos of weak hands. It'll be very easy to play against that if you notice a player's tendencies where they're maybe always 3-betting the low suited connectors and then they're always 3-betting aces through 10s. So it's important that you have a mixed strategy as a 3-better so that you essentially have a lot of things going for you. One, board coverage, having a different hand in a different scenario that someone's not expecting is advantageous. Two, blocker effects. Having a high suited card is going to be good because it blocks a lot of the 4-bets from the button. And three, playability post-flop. If you have something like 7-6, 8-7, 6-5, these are good hands that flop a lot of equity that are playable to, bet flop, bet turn at a high frequency, depending on what texture falls. So there's a lot of good reasons to mix up your strategies for 3-betting pre. So that's what we're doing here. And if we do have a call, we're going to go post-flop. Because this is a video for single raise pots, we're going to focus more on the calling range. So the calling range looks a lot like this, and it lacks some key hands, 10s through aces. So you can already tell that post-flop, a lot of the Broadway flops are going to favor the button because the big blind is going to lack some key hands in this region, which ace-king type of boards, we're going to see a very unique strategy. And I'll get to that in a minute. So the next thing we're going to do is look at the aggregated reports because the single raise pot has one action and a call. So we have a raise, a call, and then we go post-flop. So the way you want to look at things post-flop are through the aggregated reports. So if you click the reports tab, it's going to pull up all of the aggregated reports, and we're going to see what the overall strategy encompasses. So if you're playing with a simple strategy, you're not going to have any leads as the big blind. However, since we're playing a more complicated strategy, we do in fact have some leads. So because this is the first node of the strategy, it's important to not overlook it. A lot of players don't have any leads at all in their game, and that's fine. The EV difference between having a lead and not having a lead when the frequency is so low isn't going to be big. If anything, it's probably going to be almost the same. However, again, as a player that's trying to get to high stakes, I want to have as complicated of a strategy that I can execute in order to gain an advantage on my opponents. So leading for me is important to cover. And you can also incorporate this in your games. It's not something that is necessarily going to be that difficult to execute because it's such a low frequency. So if you spend some time on it, it might be worth adding a lead, especially if players are responding poorly to your leads. So what boards can we lead out of the big blind in a single raise pot? First off, I like to look at the frequency and organize it to the highest frequency. So then we look over to the left and see what board textures are leading at a high frequency. We have a lot of 6-high boards. That's the first thing that pops out to me. 6-high boards, connected boards. This makes sense because we're defending hands like 7-6 offsuit. We're defending hands like 5 deuce suited, right? Which the button will not be opening. So already we tend to have an advantage or close to an advantage on these lower board textures, which we have the nuts and they don't. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the best hands advantage, which can be found in the ranges. You can see this little chart here, and it'll show you who has the best hands advantage, right? Who has the equity advantage? Who has the EV advantage? So this is something that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. If you're not, you go back and you can find some videos on GTO Wizard about all of these stats here. But the main thing that's going to dictate a lot of our strategy is the equity buckets, the EV, the equity. This is how I think in terms of, do I want to be leading this board? Do I not want to be leading this board? So if we look at the best hands advantage, it's in the favor of the button. However, like I was mentioning, the big blind is going to have some hands that, oh wait, maybe not this particular flop, sorry. Let's go back to a better example here. So something like 6-4-3, that's a better example because that's a board that we could perceivably lead. And if we look at the best hands advantage, it's now in favor of the big blind, despite the button being the aggressor pre-flop, right? So this is an age-old heuristic that was wrong, that the pre-flop aggressor should always be driving the action. And the out-of-position player should always be checking. So that's just wrong in theory, because the things that drive the action are actually going to be the things we just talked about, the best hands advantage and the EV and equity advantages. So in a board texture scenario like this, 643, you see the equity advantage and the best hands advantage. So it makes sense that the big blind would want to lead a board texture, a texture like this. And if you click over the best hands, you can see, like I said before, there's a lot of combos that are going to be absent in the button range. So things like 5-2 suited, which is now the nuts, 6-3 suited, which is going to be 2 pair. A lot of the low pocket pairs are going to be in the range as well, because they're not 3-betting pre-flop as the big blind. So pocket 3s and pocket 4s are 100% in range. So there lacks an advantage of straights and 2 pairs on textures like this for the button. So you can see that's why we have a leading range. That's why I'm going to look at the different leading scenarios. So that being said, this is going to apply for every single scenario we look at. We're always going to look and see if there's a leading range. And if so, what kind of texture makes sense for a leading range with this particular scenario. So in this one, 6 high boards make the most sense. There are some unique boards that are going to pop up, something like ace 5-3, and that's going to be a lead for the same reason that 6-4-3 is also a lead at a frequency. And that's because we have hands like 4-2 suited, and we still have all of the pocket 5s and pocket 3s in our range. So we still have a lot of strong hands that want to have a lead on this flop texture at a mixed strategy. So pretty standard. I went over this in depth in the first original Study Chronicles. I just wanted to reiterate everything that we've kind of covered, because not only have I learned more about the game since I last did the Study Chronicles, but it all still applies, right? Nothing has really changed in terms of game theory, in terms of the way the solver solves a game, the way heads up is looking in a Nash equilibrium. The only thing that's really changed is maybe the accuracy has gotten a bit better, and some of the methods for getting to the answer have been quicker, maybe, again, more accurate on rivers and stuff like that. So the theory is still good. Don't worry, you don't have to drastically change your entire game because advancements in game theory have happened. Not really. So we look at the leading strategy here. Now, what if we lead? How does the button respond to that? Well, the button is going to have a mixed strategy of raising for 50%, raising for 100%. Now, again, this is a more complicated strategy because you have multiple sizings. So if you have 2 sizings, the solver may choose to balance that. If you have 1 sizing, it makes things a little easier. You don't lose as much EV. But if you understand the theory behind why you want to raise bigger or why you want to raise smaller or medium in this case, then it'll enhance your ability to compete against tough opponents, because tough opponents aren't going to just raise one size every single time. Tough opponents are going to understand, oh, my hand is a more polar hand on this particular texture. I can probably raise bigger with this combo. And then when they do raise bigger, you're not just sitting there like, oh, shoot, I only had 1 sizing. I don't know what to do against this bigger sizing. So it is good to look at least 2 sizings for raising a flop and understand why the solver wants to go for the big size versus the medium size. So if we look at particular textures in which we raise medium, you'll see that there's a lot of, first of all, let me clarify, there's going to be some solver noise with this strategy, because the big blind will lead sometimes at 1%, and that will throw off a lot of the accuracy to the solution. So I don't want to go too in depth into the response to the lead unless I see a board texture that's very prevalent and an obvious lead. So whenever there's a very low frequency percent chance that the solver leads a board, it's going to still pop up in the aggregated reports. Even if it's a 0.02% chance like this for the ace board, you're still going to see it pop up in the aggregated reports as what do we do against a lead, because it's just part of the strategy. So that's why it pops up here for the button that we're going to be raising at a very high frequency. However, that is solver noise. If you're not familiar with solver noise is, it's essentially a low accuracy scenario that the solver tries to come up with a strategy, but it's not going to be something that's reliable, because essentially the solver hasn't had enough time to completely solve the scenario. So there's always going to be a margin of error, and that throws off some of the aggregated reports. So that might be something that's not talked about in other videos, when to ignore solver noise. It's going to be in the low frequency scenarios that just don't really exist. And then the solver keeps going with it. And then now you get this aggregated report that doesn't really look too accurate. So you have to be careful when going through aggregated reports. So in this scenario, I would much rather just look at maybe not the aggregated reports, but maybe something like an individual board which has a high leading frequency, so we know how to address a lead as the button. So if we look back at the strategy on this 643 board, which is a high frequency lead board, maybe we can derive some heuristics from that as the button. And you can see that there is no raising 100% anymore. There's just raising 50%. That might be because, again, this is a board texture that favors the big blind. And so whenever the board texture favors a certain opponent, it's a little less likely you're going to see the pot-sized raise unless there's a very specific reason. So the medium raise, you can see we're responding with raising a lot of different combos here. And I like to look at this section here when I'm looking at specific board textures, because it gives you a bird's eye view of, okay, what hand category should I look at? What hand category do I want to raise with this board texture? And you can see that straights are the obvious one to be raising because they are 7-5 is the nuts. So the highest frequency combos you're going to be raising here is a straight. Everything else at a bird's eye view you can see is going to be a mixed strategy. So it's not ever going to be a pure raise versus a lead, which is important to understand, because if you're just raising all of your like over pairs and your straights, when you get to the turn, you're going to be really weak. So one thing about the solver is that it likes to play a very defensive strategy. It likes to be very balanced. You'll see a lot of calling in position rather than raising. And then out of position, you have a little bit of a different scenario. So in position, you can almost never go wrong with calling with strong hands. I say almost because, again, it's going to vary depending on the texture. But as a heuristic, if you don't know what to do against a lead, calling can't be that bad. So we look at some other combos here, and you can see that, again, a majority of our strategy is call. But there are a lot of combos that do want to just start getting money in. Combos like pocket sixes, pocket fours, pocket threes, all of them are a set. We have some hands that might have a lot of value but are more vulnerable. So you see a lot of raises from the overpairs that, you know, are vulnerable to overcards, like 9s and 8s and 7s that still have a lot of equity. And then the hands like aces, which are not very vulnerable versus a lead, are going to call the most. So you have this strategy here. Looks fairly, logical, right? The more you look at a solver, the more you study these outputs, the more you look at these matrices, the more you'll start to see a lot of trends in an equilibrium. And that's going to leak into other scenarios as well. So really in-depth studying on one scenario can be helpful for a lot of scenarios. A lot of people say it's pointless to spend a lot of time on one board texture. That's not going to happen very often. But I would counter with every single board texture has a lot to teach us if we're looking for the heuristics instead of just solving the specific board. So we have this scenario. We have a lead, we have a raise, we have a call. I'm not going to go all the way to the turn river because this could be forever if I did that for every single scenario, but I just wanted to look at the basic single raise pot strategies here. So after the leading, the most common thing is going to be a check, or not after the leading, before the leading, the most common thing is a check, but I just wanted to look at lead first. So if we check, here's the button strategy. The button strategy is going to be either more complex or simple depending on your solution. This solution has 4 sizings. Now, don't get scared. There's a good way of simplifying a complex strategy outside of just taking away options, okay? So a lot of people see 4 sizings or 5 sizings, and then they start freaking out and they say this is too complex for a human to understand. What I like to do with a complex solution is I like to group the sizings in my mind, okay? So even though there's 4 sizings, right, there's going to be 4 categories. And then if you have anything over 4 sizings, they're all going to go into that category. So let's say we have a 33% bet. If we group that, there's an option to group here. You'll see that there's 4 different categories. There's bet small, there's bet medium, and there's bet large and overbet. So in theory, the solver is typically going to have these 4 categories for most situations. When you look at a simple solution, you actually start to get rid of some categories, right? So the idea is you have a simple solution, but it removes some categories and some hand groupings and an entire strategy, in fact, that you start to polarize immediately on either the flop or you only polarize on the turn. So this can have some benefits in execution, but it also reduces your understanding of different strategies on flops and turns and rivers. So even though it's complicated and has 4 categories, the solver is rarely going to choose 4 categories on every single street. On the flop, it's most common you'll see 4 categories, but on turns and rivers, you're usually going to see 2, maybe 3, depending on the runouts. So it's not going to be as complicated and scary as you might think at first. And the more you use it, the more you'll get comfortable, the more you'll understand, okay, why does the solver bet small? Why does the solver bet medium? Why does the solver bet large? And once you understand that, again, it's going to carry over to all of the other scenarios. So just getting a good idea of why the solver is using these sizings will allow you to carry that over and to completely understand a strategy in different scenarios. Okay, so what sizing is the button going to use against the big blind at an overall frequency? We're ignoring the single flop, okay? So don't get caught up on 643 anymore. We're going to look at an overview of what the button wants to do, and that's going to be in the reports. So this is going to be more accurate. We talked about solver noise. This is the most common scenario. So this is going to likely be the most accurate solution because the more common, the higher frequency a scenario, the more likely the solver has had time to solve down to a higher accuracy. It's going to be, the first things that a lot of these solver libraries address are the more frequent scenarios, so they have more time to run their sims, to solve down to a higher accuracy, etc. I hope I'm not being too redundant with some things, but I'm just really trying to drill the important fundamentals of how to approach all of this. So the first episode might be a little more dense, and as we go on, it'll be a little more streamlined. So apologies if it does get a little in the weeds. I'm trying to cover a lot in a small amount of time. So here's our strategy versus the big blind. You can see that check is close to 50%. So the most common thing you're going to see is a bet from the small blind. And again, we've grouped these sizings into 4 different groups. So we have overbet, large, medium, and small. And like I mentioned, on flops, usually you're going to see a combination of all of these different sizings because we have not only premium hands, but a lot of garbage hands, a lot of medium hands, a lot of weak hands. There's a lot of categories when you have a wide range on the button. Again, if you have a wider range, you're going to have more categories. The tighter your range, it might split the strategy into only 2 sizings or 2 categories. So first, we'll see what the most common sizing is, and that's bet small. So what boards are we betting small on? Well, it's probably going to be the boards in which we have a big range advantage. So aces, kings, queen high, 2 broadways, a lot of the 2 Broadway board textures. The more I look on the left, the more I get an understanding of, okay, what heuristics are going to be bet small. The thing that's driving, again, our strategy is the range versus range compositions. Do we have a range advantage on a certain board? If we change this to something like ace, ace, let's go jack. This is a board that's going to favor the button heavily, right? We're going to have all of the quads, all of the ace king, all of the ace queen, most of the ace jack, etc. So depending on the texture, that's going to dictate a lot of your strategy. Do you want to have a category that has a lot of small betting? Do you want to have a category of hands that have a lot of over betting? It depends on the texture, depends on the best hands, who has the best hands advantage, who has the equity advantage, what's our position, what's the SPR, what do the weaker hands want to do. So as we get into the drills, I'll go a little bit more in depth into my thought process on each hand that I play and cover that better. But that's going to be your friend when you're looking through all of these different scenarios, is the range versus range tab here. And it's going to help you if you have a question like, why do I only small bet 10% here and check 90%? Well, look into the range tab. That's probably where your answer is going to come from, right? So we have a check. We have a lot of different bet sizes to choose from. Small bet's going to be the most common. We're going to be checking about half the time. And then we have some over bets, large bets, and medium bets. So the other thing I like to look at really quickly is, okay, so what are we going to overbet? Well, it looks like board textures that are favoring our range that are lacking in the big blind. So this is going to be a common heuristic in the future too. So ace, king, 4, if we look at this board texture, you'll see it's going to have a lot of properties that are advantageous for the button that aren't going to be in the big blind. So for example, the button's going to have all pocket aces, all pocket kings, ace king suited, ace king offsuit, even ace 4 suited at a higher frequency because big blind is going to be 3-betting that. So there's a lot going for the button in this spot, so much so that we have an overbet. Okay, so this is overbetting 101. If you have a very big best hands nutted advantage, overbet can be an option on the flop. So if you're unsure about whether or not you want to overbet, make sure that you're overbetting the fundamentally sound flops, which are going to be ace king, ace queen type board textures, because we're going to have a big best hands advantage over the big blind. So again, hands like ace king, aces, ace king suited, ace queen suited, ace queen offsuit. So you can just see visually that that's all lacking for the big blind. So it's spots like this that you'll see the overbet the most. Betting large is similar to overbetting. However, it's going to be a notch below the value. So if you think about what you want to be betting large with, it'll be textures in which you have an advantage, but villain still is starting to pick up some stronger hands that they can combat you with, right? So on a Queen Jack 10 board, we may have something like Ace King. We may have something like King 9 suited. We have pocket queens, pocket jacks, pocket 10s, right? But the big blind still is capable of having King 9 and 9-8, which are very strong hands on a texture like this. So there are going to be some, top end hands that the big blind is going to be able to defend against you. And so large bet is perhaps a better choice at a mixed strategy. Again, everything's going to be mixed. We'll get into that. But yeah, large sizing is those kinds of textures where we have a big advantage, but big blind might have something to say about it. So here's a good example, 7-6 deuce. This is a texture where we have a big overpair advantage, okay? This is commonly a large bet because of our overpair advantage, aces, kings, queens, and jacks, which the big blind's not going to have because they're 3-betting all of those hands. So we have a lot of large betting. But big blind has pocket 7s, pocket 6s, and pocket deuces, all very strong hands to defend against some overbets. So we see the solver typically likes to use a large bet on this kind of texture. So if we look at the ranges again, we'll see that we clearly have the best hands advantage. We clearly have a equity advantage, but we still aren't overbetting because of the response here from the big blind of having some of the stronger hands. So they do have 7-6 offsuit, which is a hand that the button's not going to have. And the other thing that is at play here is that just because we have overpairs doesn't mean we want to fire huge. Because if we're firing huge and the big blind doesn't have that many hands to call with, then we're only going to get called by these nutted hands here, right? So on board textures like this, it's not always advantageous to fire really big because the board texture is going to change, first of all. Second of all, the big blind's not going to have a lot of very strong hands to defend. When you overbet twice or 3 times, you're just going to get a lot of folds by the river. And so large size is kind of the best of both worlds of the overbet where we're pushing an advantage, but also small enough of a bet that villain can call multiple streets on flop, turn, river. So large is a little tricky to understand. It's not as obvious as overbet and bet small, but it is a good sizing to use on certain textures. Bet medium is, I would say, again, a mixture of kind of the theory behind bet small and bet large. It's going to be a texture that's good for us. However, we can't get away with maybe range betting this flop. We have to split up our strategy between maybe a smaller size or a large size, and then medium as well. So medium board textures are going to be boards like paired boards, where again, we're going to have an overpair advantage. However, trips is going to be a common category on a paired board, which is an equalizer for the big blind and the button. So scenarios like this, you're going to see, again, we don't want to just start overbet ripping because our overpair category isn't capable of getting 3 streets of value. So instead of overbetting with our overpairs, you're going to see a lot of medium betting on the flop, and maybe on the turn we start overbetting, but that we'll get to turn and river play another time or later in this episode. But the main thing is choosing your sizings. So we've covered overbet, bet large, and bet medium. This is our fundamental strategy. It's going to cover every single flop decision in a single raise pot. And so I just wanted to detail why I use bet small, bet medium, bet large, and overbet, and how to figure out when to use those sizings, because I think that's something I get asked a lot is when do I overbet? When do I small bet? Why do you use 4 sizings? How do I construct my range? This is the bare bones fundamentals of what I'm doing and thinking on every flop decision. So we look at this. We know what the call range looks like. We know what the opening range looks like. We looked at some leading. We've looked at a little bit of responses to leading, but now we need to look at the response to a c-bet, okay? So this is where it can get, it can get monotonous and repetitive because you kind of have to go through one sizing. Okay, I'm going to look at the responses to this. How does that change versus this sizing? How does this change versus that sizing? If you have one sizing, it's a lot easier to study. But again, you're not going to be as thorough. You might not understand how to adjust to other players. So what I like to do is go through each sizing, look at how that changes my overall strategy as the big blind. So we're going to look at the reports again, ignore the individual board. So we're going to see, go back to flops here. If the button uses a small sizing, what is our main strategy? Okay, this is what I'm most interested in because this is going to help me understand the bird's eye view of everything I'm doing in a scenario. Well, it looks like we're calling about half the time. Looks like we're raising about 13-14% of the time, and we're mixing between a medium and large sizing. So when should I check raise using the medium sizing? Well, it's going to favor using the medium size on paired boards. Again, very similar to the button strategy of c-betting paired boards. We're using the medium sizing. And that's because we're going to have obviously some really strong hands like trips, but we're also going to have some medium strength hands that might want to just protect against a c-bet. Something like pocket sixes on a 10 deuce, a 10-10 deuce board. So if I pull up this board randomly, looks like this is a pretty high frequency board to bet. Let me study this spot. So you can always click study this spot on a board texture in the aggregated reports. So if we look at our check raising frequency, well, looking at some of the hand candidates, we have those pocket sixes, pocket sevens. If we go to the filters, again, I really like looking at the filters for the categories. We have some second pair, even some 2x. We have some, semi bluffs with ace high. We have some under pairs, like we were mentioning before, threes versus nines. If you want to know, here's another important thing to understand. If you want to know if you're bluffing or you're value betting, or you're merging something in between, you want to look at the equity buckets. The equity buckets will tell you all you want to know about whether or not this is going to be a clear value raise. If you look at the best hands, this is clearly a value raise. We have trips, right? All of our best hands are either a full house or trips. If you look at the good hands, you'll see a little bit more of a merged value range, meaning maybe we're ahead of some of their weak c-bets, but maybe we're behind some of their value bets. So hands like 2x, so bottom pair here, and then all of those medium strength pairs are going to be in good hands category. So when you're raising, you have to kind of understand, okay, why am I raising? Am I raising because I have a best hand, or am I raising because I have a good hand? Maybe I don't want to triple barrel for value here after I check raise. So understanding where your hand category lies will be really important in dictating your strategy. So if you want to look at some of your bluffs, you would look in your trash hands. These are hands that clearly aren't doing very well on the flop, but are hoping to fold out something better on either the flop or on future streets. So something like Queen 7 of hearts, this is clearly not a value raise. We have Queen high. In fact, we barely can show this down and hope to win, if ever. So the solver likes to sometimes pair those weaker hands with the really strong hands. So if we have trips, we need some bluffs. This is the way the solver thinks. It categorizes hands into trash, weak, good, and best, and then it groups them together depending on their equity and playability on the flop. So at first glance, you'll think, why the hell is the solver check raising something like Queen 7 suited? It's complicated, but to my best guess, it's going to have some kind of playability against the weaker hands. So if the button is always c-betting this flop with something like ace high or king high, queen high is going to have inherent value in check raising to get them to fold the better hands. So already there's good things happening with check raising a queen high hand on this texture. Next, we look at the suits. You can see that there's an obvious lack of check raising with the spades, and that's because it doesn't have any backdoor flush draw equity, which is a big part of how the solver thinks. The solver wants to usually use something that has better playability with the bluffs. It's not going to just check raise some random 2 cards that don't really connect with the texture or have the ability to make a big hand. Usually it's going to have some kind of equity with the hand to check raise bluff it. So that's where you see the clubs, the hearts, and the diamonds come into play. Next, you see, okay, so why is a queen important? Well, a queen is really important because it removes some of the strongest hands of the button. Pocket queens and queen 10 suited are 2 really strong hands, and queen 10 offsuit are really strong hands for the button to have here. So the blocker effect is also coming into a play here, right? So we're blocking the strong hands. Perhaps we're unblocking ace high and king high, which are the weaker hands that have to fold, which we're also losing to. And so that's why you see something like queen 7 check raising this flop, right? And we're going to choose that medium sizing because, again, we have a lot of different categories for check raising the flop here. Solver likes to use mostly the medium sizing. So that's the way that I'm looking to understand a scenario. And if you want to deep dive, again, you can go into the ranges, you can go into the reports, you can go back and forth, look at each sizing, understand why the solver is using each sizing. But that's the fundamentals of it all. So we have how to respond versus a small size. In theory, the larger you go, the smaller your raise size will be against the player and the less frequent you'll see a raise. So against the small raise, ignore this board texture. This is an overall strategy right now that we're looking at. Against the small size, we're using a 14-ish% frequency to check raise. Against the overbet size, if the button chooses overbet on the proper textures, we're looking at a much less frequency of check raising. Now it shrinks down to only 5.2%, and it never uses the large. The large is typically when you want to shovel money into the pots, have a big advantage, or lack an advantage, and you want to go very polarized, and you're setting up the hand to get all of the money in. When someone overbets against you, then you don't need to raise large because even a medium raise will get all the money in because there's already so much money in the pot. So typically against larger sizings, you want to go smaller raises and less frequent. You can also just defend against these overbets because, again, the button is saying, I'm going to put all the money in. That's what that overbet is essentially saying. I'm going to go 3 streets. I'm trying to get all the money in. You can call me or you can fold, right? So you go into this mode of bluff catching as the big blind against an overbet. And you don't really want to raise that often because it's hard to construct. We'll get into that later. But the main theory is raising more against small bet, raising less against overbet, using smaller sizings against large, using some small sizings and some bigger sizings versus the small bets. So I think that covers most everything we need to look at for the small blind versus the big blind, button versus the big blind in a single raise pot. Let's get into some drills. So in Tombos's spreadsheet, you can see that, oops, I tried to use the draw tool on the spreadsheet. That's the thing. After I okay, there we go. Let's stop touching buttons. After I use GTO Wizard, I always try and draw on other sites, and it doesn't end up working. Okay, I keep pressing things. Hold on. 1 second. There we go. No more pressing things. Okay, button versus big blind. So the drill is already set up. However, you need to adjust it if you're going to use a different solution. So I'm going to use, again, general, NL500, GTO, and we're mostly going to look at 100 big blinds. So this should work if I confirm that. And all of his other settings you can see here in the settings option. I like to have a low RNG. That's what I use to distinguish whether I'm going to play one strategy or another. But you don't need to use the RNG if you don't want to. I think it's good to train with an RNG because it gets you into the mindset of thinking, okay, this is a spot I should bet sometimes and maybe I should check sometimes. How do you determine that? It's better to use an RNG than to just guess in the moment. So if you have access to an RNG, you're allowed to use it, then I suggest using it. We're going to do 50 hands on every scenario, okay? So we're going to drill this 50 hands. We're going to go rapid fire. If I have a mistake, we're going to look at it after and break it down. Let's start our training. I'm going to put this into focus mode so that it looks a little nicer for you guys. But let's dive in. So Ace, Ace, King board. Very unique board off of the rip. Okay, we just talked about how this looks like a board texture that really favors the button. And on these kinds of textures, you typically want to overbet. Now, there's a competing thing that's happening in this hand, and that's it's a paired board. Okay, so paired boards are a little trickier because, again, it's hard to get a lot of value if you're triple overbetting on a paired board. Villain has to basically have trips in order to call you down. So paired boards typically go smaller or medium. However, this is an ace, ace, king paired board, so it wouldn't surprise me if we had a lot of overbets as well. So I'm going to, with this hand, mostly small bet or check, because this isn't really a texture I think I want to be betting 3 streets, but again, this is a board texture which we have a big advantage. I don't know if check is even an option here because it's such a good board for us. So I'm going to do something I know is likely to be an option, which is bet small. I'm going to bet small. Once villain calls and leads, okay, so interesting scenario, right? Big blind defends the ace, ace, king board and then leads the turn. Well, like I mentioned, it's really hard for big blind to defend this board. So when they do continue, it's going to be a very polar range. It's going to be an ace, or it's going to be some kind of spade draw, or it's going to be some kind of Broadway draw. Well, if they have a lot of ace X and Broadway draws on a Broadway card, it makes sense for the big blind to lead. So against this, I am going to still continue because they can still have missed spades, or maybe a low pocket pair they start turning into a bluff. Big blind bets the river. This is tricky. Well, we block full houses. They shouldn't have too many of those. So I'm expecting to see a lot of ace X or queen 10. I don't really block any of that, which is the problem. But I unblock a lot of the bluffs that they probably have. So if they are bluffing here, it might be something like low spades. It might be something like pocket deuces. So I think I can mix a call here, but I'm not happy about it. And they ended up having the low pair for the bluff. Queen 10-4. So this is not a texture that we're going to lead. Anytime we're in the big blind, we're going to consider leading. This is not one of those textures. Again, 6 high boards are more likely to be led. We flopped bottom pairs, so this is where it gets a little tricky. I haven't talked too much about how to construct all of these, strategies for check raising or for c-betting exactly what your range looks like. But as they come up, it's natural to talk about them, so I figured I'd do it this way. This is a spot in which the button should have an advantage. However, we still have a lot of strong hands on this texture. We have queen 10, we have pocket fours, we have queen 4 suited, 10-4 suited might even be defending here. So it makes sense to have some check raises. Blocking the bottom pair is good. It blocks the strongest value from the button of 2 pair plus and sets. Having an ace is good. It blocks ace queen. So this could be a candidate for check raising as a bluff. And the thing we're going to start doing with this hand is trying to get hands like 10x to fold on either the flop or future streets. So the question is, do I want to check raise this hand? Is this the best hand to be check raising? Because we're still beating a lot of hands as well, right? Having backdoor flush draws, very important, like we mentioned earlier, for check raise bluffing. We want to have some more equity so that if we turn a heart or a spade, we pick up more equity. I'm not sure. I think this could go either way, but I'm going to call most of the time. So you saw that it was only an 88% call, which means it was probably a 12% raise. So we're going to check the turn. This isn't the turn we want to lead. Queen 10, 4, 7, jack. Going to check. Question mark. Yeah. So I'm playing through the entire hands because I think it's important not just to study the flop strategies and defending against the flop strategies, but to understand the entire scenario, you have to play through the entire hand because it really gives you a better view of why you're flop betting in the first place or why you're check raising the flop in the first place. So important to do that. Okay, so queen 8-4 board, button versus big blind. We have an advantage here most of the time because we have pocket queens at a full frequency, pocket eights at a full frequency. We have all the 2 pair hands. We have some overpairs like pocket kings and pocket aces. So typically, this is a good board for us. However, do we want to overbet? It's close. I think you can make an argument for overbetting. And if we were to overbet, this would be a very good hand for doing it because we unblock the top pair hands of the villain, which can call 3 streets. So we're talking about, can I get 3 streets with an overbet? The answer here is yeah, we can. We can get 3 streets from queen jack, queen 10, queen 9. Maybe some ace queen off they didn't 3-bet. So I think overbet is an option. I think large bet is an option. I don't know if I want to check. Because we did RNG a high number, which means passive. So for those of you that, RNG high numbers as aggressive, this is the opposite. We use passive with high numbers and low numbers is aggressive. So this is a passive roll. So if I had a smaller sizing or a check, I might choose that. I think this is one of those flops that has all 4 options that we also mentioned. So let's take the option. Gosh, this is such a good large bet though. I'm going to take the option I think I know is going to be part of a strategy, and that's overbet. So you saw that it was, in fact, a 50% overbet. Queen 7-4, button versus big blind. So this is defending a low frequency hand out of the big blind. Okay, so this is the first node to talk about check, check. Okay, so button checks back in position. What do we do as the big blind? Again, a little bit of a complicated strategy. We have not 4 sizings, but 6 sizings here. So we have bet 33, bet 50, bet 75, bet 125, bet 175, and bet 250. However, again, if you group these sizings, we only have 3 to 4. So we have 4 in this case. We have overbet, which encompasses 125, 175, and 250. We have large bet, which is 75. We have medium bet, which is 50, and small bet, which is 33. So when dividing a range, think about, does my hand want to bet all of the money? Do we want to get all of the money in on the turn and river? If the answer is yes, we probably want to overbet. Do we want to bet large, but maybe large on the river? Well, then maybe we have a weaker hand. Do we want to bet small? Maybe we have a very weak hand, but we don't want to put in a lot of money, right? So on a texture like this, the overbets are fairly obvious. The overbets are going to be 5-6 for a straight. They're going to be pocket 4s, pocket 7s, pocket 8s, queen 8. Usually overbets are going to be 2 pair plus. It's very rare you see overbets with a single pair. This might be one of the exceptions because we have a very strong 1 pair hand. However, usually overbets are going to be very strong and then have a lot of bluffs with good equity. So spade draws, combo draws, that's where you pull your bluffs from. The large size is going to be hands similar like this. We have a very strong 1 pair hand, but we don't want to overbet. Medium size, same idea. We have maybe top pair, but we don't want to put in large amounts of money. Small bets are going to encompass most of those smaller combos, like maybe pocket 9s here, maybe an 8, maybe some of the weakest queen X that doesn't want to go even medium sizing. So this hand, I think, makes sense to go large or medium, maybe some overbets. So I'm going to pick large. And you can see that was 20% frequency, so that was correct. 8-8 deuce, so paired board again. We have a medium sizing and a small sizing. Again, remember, we don't really overbet these textures. That being said, we have a hand that doesn't really want to bluff because we actually have some showdown value. So if you think back to the equity buckets, this is a hand that maybe we don't want to bet because we just want to get to showdown value. Maybe this is categorized as either a good or a weak hand. Weak hands generally don't want to try and inflate the pot. They just want to get to showdown. So this is a good spot to check at a high frequency. Get to the turn, gonna check again, just trying to get to showdown. And the river is a king, but we have ace high. We still beat a lot of hands in the big blind's defending range, so we are going to check the river. And they have 10 high, we win the pot. Queen 4 deuce. Big blind versus button. We're going to never lead. Facing a bet. This is just going to be too weak to call here. However, you can call weak hands. You just have to make sure you have some decent equity. So this is a trash hand. Typically, trash hands aren't going to be continued with unless there's some extra equity involved, like maybe a straight draw or a gut shot. But king high, out of position, easy fold. All right, we're in position again on the button on a paired board. This is going to be a mixture of medium and small bet. This is a pretty strong hand because they don't have ace queen very often. As you saw, it's a mixed strategy, mostly a 3-bet. They're going to have some 3x, but it's going to be a lot of medium strength hands for them. Pocket 5s, pocket 4s, pocket 6s, ace high. It's pretty tricky to play out of position on a paired board. So I think medium bet or small bet are both going to be good. I'm going to go for the medium size. Villain calls. Turn is a 10 of spades. So now we have to ask ourselves, this is our first turn c-bet scenario. How do we want to construct our range going forward? We have 4 different categories. We have small bet, medium bet, large bet, over bet. What makes sense here? First of all, solver is almost never going to follow up a flop bet with a small sizing on the turn. Typically, when you're in position, so there are some exceptions to this rule, but typically when you're in position, you want to size up because the hands that do want to use a small sizing can just check back and see a river and get to showdown, right? So instead, solver likes to check those hands, but then uses a bigger sizing with the value hands or the bluffs that don't have as much showdown value, that maybe have some equity, that can get better hands to fold from the big blind. So this is a hand that's in between, right? We have a strong hands with top pair on the flop, but once the 10 comes in, there's now a flush. So that adds a new category of hands that beat our hand. So we have to ask ourselves, can I go for a turn value bet and a river value bet if the river bricks? If the answer is no, then check is definitely a viable option here for us. And then we can bet the river for value. If the answer is yes, then we want to continue betting either a medium, a large, or even an overbet sizing. So on this particular turn, I think it's fine to either mix a bet on the turn or check the turn and bet the river. This is pretty close, I would say. We rolled an aggressive number. I think that it's okay to bet this hand because we still have a lot of value against pocket sixes with a spade, other pairs with a spade, worse queen combos, maybe some ace 10 that floated the flop out of position or king 10. So I'm going to go 50% here. That was an inaccuracy. We'll get to that a little later. But then once we get to the river, we're basically repping a queen if we're betting, or a flush, a very strong flush, or a 3. So I'm going to go polarized. And I think I'm going to go bet 150 here. All right, so we had 2 inaccuracies on that hand. I can choose to stop my little session here, or I can go over them at the end. I typically like to look at the inaccuracies as I make them because I think it has a better chance of sticking into my head if I go over them more in depth. So let's pull up that hand and see why we made a mistake. So first of all, on the flop, we used the medium sizing. That is okay, but it's not a very high frequency play. Is my head blocking that? No. We'll move my head right here just so we can go over some of the detailed response. So half pot, low frequency play. Turn, you can actually see that bet is fine. However, the solver chooses the large size instead of the medium size. So this is where, you get kind of stuck in the weeds. Like my play wasn't bad. It wasn't that bad. However, if I'm going to optimize my strategy, maybe I choose a larger sizing with this hand. Maybe that says that there's another hand that might want to go 50 on the turn, but not mine. Mine rather would go large because it's still one of the best top pair hands that we can have. Maybe 50 isn't used. So let's go to the strategy and look. Well, it looks like 50 is very rarely used, if ever. So solver, again, with that idea that we talked about polarizing, has a polarized strategy on the turn. So this is only 2 categories to worry about. Do I want to large bet or do I want to over bet? So again, that heuristic of not betting small applies here. And we have to choose whether or not our hand is worth an over bet, a large bet, or if we feel like maybe we can just check this and then take this strategy to the river. And in this case, with the king queen, it wants to go large or check. And then if villain calls and the river bricks off, I have a feeling we're going to see a lot of checking on the river. Let's see. With king queen. King queen, pure check. Yeah. So it's, again, not strong enough to overbet the turn, but strong enough to large bet, get value. And then once you get to the river, you reassess what can we get value from? And at this stage, not very many hands that are worse, and we're blocking those hands with our king. So always be thinking about, how does my hand line up against their range after I take a certain action? So we missed out on a large bet. And then if we had large bet, we would have checked the river. If I played a check, I'm guessing that we're going to bet the river for value if the big blind checks. And you can see here, we're betting medium because we now have a medium strength hand on the river. We have some weaker hands that might want to bet medium size as well. So maybe if we have an ace 10, king 10, maybe we can get a medium bet in there with those hands. Maybe that's a little too out of line. I don't know. Looks like ace 10 and king 10 want to mainly check. So most of our medium value is going to be derived from top pair. So having hands like queen 5, queen 9, those types of hands. All right, moving on. Big blind versus button here. Jack 8-7, never going to lead because it's not a favorable flop for us. Villain chooses a medium sizing. So they're essentially saying they have some kind of category of top pair, maybe some straights at this stage early on. It's hard to tell, but I'm going to defend. Turn is very spicy. Brings in a lot of different categories. Anytime a turn brings in more categories, you have to reassess how your hand lines up against those categories. Obviously, our hand is now maybe even a trash hand because there's a straight, there's a flush, there's better overpairs, there's better top pairs. So this is going to be a check. And I think we can just check fold on the turn because of how bad our hand is. And we got bluffed, but that's just part of the game. King 7-5. Let me get some water. Okay. So King 7-5. This is a board where, again, we have probably the range advantage because we have more strong king combos. However, villain has King 7, King 5. They have 7s and 5s. They have all the strong hands. They have some big draws as well, which have a lot of equity, like 8-6 of spades. So they do have a lot of responses. This isn't going to typically be an overbet. It's mostly going to be either a small bet, a medium bet, or a large bet. This hand particularly, I think, would like to mix between all of those strategies. It's strong enough to go large. Is it though? Maybe not, actually. Maybe it doesn't want to go large. Maybe we go large with like ace king or king queen, something a little stronger. But it is strong enough to bet. So I'm actually going to default to bet small here. I think that's a good strat. And on the turn, this is a very interesting card. So an ace coming onto the turn really polarizes our strategy because top pair on the flop no longer is top pair and doesn't really want to go for more value because it's hard to get called by worse hands. So anytime an ace hits the turn, you're going to see more of a large bet or check strategy. Sometimes this is one of those scenarios that small bet kind of makes sense because if you have something like king queen, maybe you'll have a small bet here, or if you have an ace, maybe you'll have a small bet here to get value from villain's weak pair with a spade, right? Maybe you'll get some value from villain's weak top pair. And in order to get that value, you have to bet small because otherwise villain's not going to be comfortable calling something like 7-8 with an 8 of spades if we're overbetting the turn. So in order to get some really thin values, small bet makes sense, but most of the time I think the solver is going to check or put in a medium or larger bet. So I'm going to check here. You can see 100% of the time. Get to the river and big blind bets out here for value. So even though this is a medium sizing, this is a very strong range. Okay. So this is usually going to be, at worst, top pair. I don't think they're able to bet this sizing with a king. Maybe king queen, but typically we're going to see mostly aces, or we're going to see a straight, two pair, or a flush. So this hand is already becoming a bluff catcher. Are we beating the bluffs? Yes. Are we beating the value? No. So in this case, this is a bluff catcher. Is this a good bluff catcher? Well, the jack of clubs doesn't really help us, does it? It doesn't block any value that they could have here, like a flush or two pair, and it doesn't really block any weak hands either. They're not going to have too many floats with a jack of clubs out of position. So this kicker is kind of a bust. Doesn't really do much for us. How is the king? How's the king of hearts doing? Well, the king of hearts obviously blocks the two pair combos, and it also blocks maybe if they're able to value bet king queen here, king queen. So it does block value, unblocks bluffs. That's good. I typically like to have both cards working for me if I'm going to make a bluff catch. So if this was the jack of spades, I think this would be a no-brainer that we could call it a frequency. But because it's a jack of clubs, I think I'm just going to fold here. And you can see villain shows up with the flush, and that we were supposed to fold a majority of the time. You saw that there was, I think, let's pull that up again. I think we could have bluff caught on the river there a little bit. You can see that, yeah, the solver wants to call 30% of the time. My head is blocking this one. Let me show you guys. Here we go. Solver wants to call 30% of the time. So it would have been an okay bluff catcher, but it's not ideal because, again, we had that jack of clubs, didn't really do much for our hand. Big blind versus button, we're out of position, never leading this flop because this is a very good flop for villain. Villain checks back. Interesting. So they're saying that they don't have a king. They're saying maybe they have pocket queens, pocket jacks, maybe a weak ace. However, because this is still a very good board for villain, we're not going to really bet that often because the only thing we can really bet for two streets at this stage is either a king or maybe I can go for a small size with an ace, right? So if I was going to bet here, it would be small size with this hand. But I think it makes more sense to have a high check frequency. So now, once we get to the river, we're going to, again, have those four sizings. It looks like actually this is cut down to 3. Small, large, and overbet. Medium is gone. So what makes sense for this hand? I think small bet. Because if we are targeting hands like pocket queens, pocket jacks, are they going to really call an overbet or a large bet? I don't think so. They're more likely going to call with worse than an ace for the small bet. So I'm going to go for the small bet. That was an inaccuracy. Villain shows up with an ace as well. Why did I get that wrong? Let's take a quick look. So it looks like the solver mostly wants to check with our hand. I guess that makes sense because we have the weakest ace, maybe the second weakest ace because the 4s and the 3 is on the board. Ace deuce offsuit, I don't think defends versus a raise very often. So you do have the weakest top pair. The solver might just think, okay, I want to really polarize this range on the river for betting. We're only going to bet a strong ace or a king. And everything else is going to go into our either bluff catching category or check fold category. An ace 5, I guess, qualifies for a good bluff catcher. So it's really just a matter of understanding where the thresholds are and what strategy makes the most sense. And in this scenario, maybe villain can't really even call pocket queens or pocket jacks on the river if I small bet, right? Maybe that's kind of too thin because they're going to fold those hands or something. I don't know. Let's see. What is the strategy here? We have small bet, overbet, and large bet. Mostly check, like we talked about. But again, it looks like the solver has chosen more of a polarized strategy where we're overbetting or checking. If we do have a small bet, it looks like we were close. It's going to be ace 6 and ace 7 and ace 8, not ace 5. So my theory was pretty close, but we were just a little bit off in the thresholds, which isn't going to be a big deal. Like, don't worry if you get some inaccuracies here and there. It's not going to be, the biggest blunder of all time if you're one notch off of value that you should have been. If you look at ace five, even the offsuit ace five is fine, but because we were blocking a spade, that maybe would be a better hand to bluff catch with, right? If you think about in terms of bluff catching, we're blocking the value. If the spade comes in and they bet, we're blocking that entire flush category. So solver chose to bluff catch that hand instead. Queen Jack 9. Let's go over this board. So I think I'm going to cover a couple more hands, but I'm not going to do the full 50. I will do the full 50 off video, and I'll update the sheet for you guys if you want to follow along with how I'm doing. But I will go over all of them off of the video. Otherwise, this is going to be a very long video. Hopefully, you guys have gotten a lot of value in understanding every single scenario we've covered and are able to apply that into all the other ones too. So let's go over 2 more scenarios and we'll wrap it up. Queen Jack 9, button versus big blind. You can see this is going to be, again, one of those strategies in which we have all of the very strong hands. However, villain can still have king 10, villain can still have 10-8, villain can still have 2 pair. So we're not really looking to overbet this flop. On top of that, this is a board texture which is considered to be fairly static. Most turn cards aren't going to change the nuts, right? So if you have a deuce through an 8, not much is going to change. If you have a board pair, it's still hard to have a lot of full houses. So this kind of texture, you don't typically want to overbet. Maybe a very polar strategy can overbet here, but typically you're not going to overbet. So that leaves us with check or medium bet or large bet. I'm going to check this time. As you can see, we have a lot of equity with a straight draw and a pair. We just want to get to showdown. Turn is a board pair. Again, I'm going to check. I don't think I can get much value from worse. And then river. Do we want to value bet this? Pretty thin to value bet third pair on a paired board. I'm going to say no, but this could be a thin value bet. Yeah, check 100%. All right, let's go over the last scenario, button versus big blind, 9-6 deuce board. Actually a pretty cool scenario because they should have a lot of large betting on the flop here, and we have a pair, so I would have been curious to see if they had bet the flop, but we do. But now that we're on the turn, I think this is an easy check. So out of position, when a turn card favors the button, it's very similar to the assessment of the flop. How does this turn interact with our range? Does this in favor of the button? Does it favor the big blind? This particular Broadway card is almost always going to favor the button because of their stronger queen X hands that they can raise pre-flop, like ace queen and king queen suited, that are going to check back the flop. So this is going to be a high frequency check from us. And villain goes for the overbet. Makes a lot of sense, right? We just mentioned they're going to have a lot of strong hands interacting with this queen. So now that's going to be what they're representing with this overbet, something like ace queen, something like king queen, and maybe something like a slow played overpair, pocket aces, pocket kings that didn't bet the flop. I don't think I'm going to be continuing here with a pair because we need more equity. We're way behind all of their value and we don't have too many ways to improve. So I think this is always going to be a pure, ooh, not a fold. Okay. We have an interesting spot before the video ends. Let's take a look. Why does the solver not want to fold versus an overbet? It looks like it wants to call. Okay, so maybe there's just enough weak hands that the solver is overbetting the turn with that a deuce is properly, defending here. So the button can, in fact, overbet bluffs. And a lot of those bluffs are going to contain hands like king high, jack high. So a pair does a good job of perhaps blocking 2 pair, like queen 2, like a slow played set maybe. If we look at the value range again of the button, you can see here's the best hands that might overbet. And you can see that queen 2 is part of that strategy. So having a 2 is good. The 5 of clubs doesn't really remove too many weaker hands on this turn because a lot of their weaker hands should be diamonds or straight draws. So if we look at the weaker hands, you can see that you'll see a lot of either gut shot straight draws or oh wait, we got to do weak hands. There we go. I was going to say, where's all the diamonds? The diamonds are going to come from king high diamonds, jack high diamonds, straight draws. So you can see a lot of like over here in the draw category, a lot of flush draws, combo draws, and then open-ended straight draws. You're going to see some gut shots. That's typically where those weak hands come from, is this draw section here. So in order to figure out where the draws are, you can look at the draws section and then click no draw if you want to see some blocker effect bluffs, which are basically hands that can't really go to showdown but still want to bluff on the turn. That's going to come from a lot of ace high and king high, the weakest ones of that category that don't necessarily want to see showdown. So against all of that, and you can see here, the 2 is not blocking any of those ace or king high bets. Maybe this is actually a good category to have. A deuce is unblocking all of these weak hands in the overbet category, and it's blocking queen 2. So we actually see a light call. We see a light call from 5 deuce on the turn. So if you don't understand why the solver is doing something, break it down. Look at the ranges. Look at how everything's interacting. It'll give you the answer if you're capable of going through all of the right things. So this is actually a check call versus an overbet. I learned something today. I hope you guys learned everything that we went through. And I'm going to continue this series. We're going to look at the next scenario, which is going to be small blind versus big blind, single raise pot. I hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned. Please click like and subscribe to help support me make these videos, and comment below what you're studying. What are you guys working on? What do you want to see in the future? All right. Have a good rest of your day.